It was just a stain on the driveway, a dark, weathered smudge from a previous owner. I never gave it a second thought, until the envelope arrived. The paper inside was cold, formal, and utterly shocking. It wasn't a welcome letter from the Homeowners Association. It was fine. A massive fine for that very stain, with a threat of more to come until it was removed. My dream home had just become a nightmare over something I didn't even do. I felt trapped, angry, and utterly powerless. But I wasn't going to take it lying down. This is the story of how a simple oil stain turned into an all-out war with my HOA, and how I discovered that sometimes the smallest crack in the pavement can reveal the deepest foundations of injustice. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a promise of stability after years of renting, a promise of a backyard for my dog to run in, and a promise of a place to finally put down roots. My name is Alex, and for me, this modest 3-bedroom with the slightly overgrown azaleas was the pinnacle of making it. Every swipe of the paint roller, every box unpacked felt like a small victory. The neighborhood, Whispering Pines, seemed to live up to its serene name. Lawns were neatly trimmed, flowers were blooming, and in the evenings you could hear the faint, friendly sounds of families settling in for the night. It felt perfect. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had lived here for decades. The closing process was smooth, and the inspection report was thorough. It noted the usual wear and tear of a lived-in home: a loose cabinet hinge, a slightly sticky window, and yes, an old set-in oil stain on the driveway, right near the garage door. It was dark gray, faded by the sun and worn by weather, a ghost of a car long gone. My realtor dismissed it as a cosmetic non-issue, and I agreed. It was just a part of the house's history, a trivial detail I'd eventually get around to power washing one lazy weekend. A week after moving in, the official welcome packet from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association arrived. I skimmed the thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs. The rules were extensive, covering everything from fence height to mailbox style to the approved shades of beige for exterior paint. It seemed a bit excessive, but I understood the desire to maintain property values. I filed the binder away on a shelf, confident I had nothing to worry about. I was a rule follower by nature. Little did I know, the most consequential rule was buried on page 87, section 12, subparagraph C. All driveways and walking surfaces must be kept free of any and all stains, oil deposits, or unsightly blemishes to uphold the community's aesthetic standards. A rule I had already, unknowingly, broken. The first fine was a shock. The second was a declaration of war. It arrived exactly 1 week after the initial notice. Not a phone call, not a friendly email, but another crisp, formal envelope from the Whispering Pines HOA. My heart sank before I even tore it open. This one wasn't a warning. It was an invoice for $250 citing failure to remediate aesthetic violation per CC&R 12C and accruing late fees. Late fees. For a problem I just learned existed. My first move was rational, polite. I found the number for the HOA management company and called. I explained, my voice straining to remain cheerful and reasonable, that I was the new homeowner, that the stain was pre-existing, and that I had the inspection report to prove it. The woman on the other end, Sylvia, had a voice that could frost glass. She recited policy like an automated recording. The covenant states the current homeowner is responsible for the property's condition, regardless of origin. You have 30 days to remediate, or the fines will double, doubling fines, for a stain. The absurdity of it was a physical weight on my chest, but I was going to be reasonable. I gathered my evidence, the inspection report, with the stain clearly noted and photographed. I even went to the county records and found the old real estate listing photos from years ago, which showed the same dark smudge on the driveway. I compiled it all into a neat PDF, a bulletproof case of innocence, and emailed it directly to the HOA board president, a man named Carl Jepson, with a polite request to dismiss the fines. The response was not an email. It was a third notice, taped to my front door. This one included a close-up, glossy photograph of the stain, circled in red Sharpie like a crime scene photo. The fine had now doubled to $500. Scrawled at the bottom in messy handwriting was a single sentence: "Clean it or pay it." The polite citizen in me died that day, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. A petty, small-minded individual had decided to flex their authority, and I was their chosen target. I tried to reason with them, and they'd responded by taking a picture of my house and defacing it with a marker. I decided to fight fire with fire. I spent an entire weekend on my hands and knees. I bought every industrial-strength cleaner, degreaser, and solvent the hardware store had. I rented a power washer with enough PSI to strip paint off a battleship. For 2 days, the driveway was a foamy, chemical-soaked battlefield. The acrid smell of citrus and petroleum solvents filled the air, making my eyes water. I scrubbed until my hands were raw and my back screamed in protest. And when the water finally cleared, the ghost of the stain remained. It was fainter, a pale gray shadow, but undeniably there. Decades of oil had seeped deep into the concrete's pores. It was permanent. I documented the entire process. I took before, during, and after videos showing the furious effort and the ultimately futile result. I sent this new evidence, a video diary of my defeat, to the HOA board. Surely they would see the effort. Surely they would understand. The fourth notice came by certified mail. Carl Jepson wasn't messing around anymore. It was a formal hearing notice. I was being summoned to appear before the full HOA board at the community clubhouse to show cause as to why the violation should not be upheld, and the fines, now totaling $1,000, be paid in full. The language was cold, legalistic, and designed to intimidate. They had seen my proof, my effort, my desperation, and their only response was to escalate. The night of the hearing, I walked into the clubhouse feeling like a prisoner heading to the gallows. The room was sterile, fluorescently lit, with a long table at the front where the board sat. Carl Jepson sat in the center, a man in his late 60s with a perfectly golf-tanned face and a cold, impatient look in his eyes. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a bored accountant, which was somehow worse. I laid out my case. I was calm, clear, and methodical. I presented the inspection report, the old listing photos, the receipts for hundreds of dollars in cleaning supplies, the video proof of my attempts. I explained that the stain was physically impossible to remove. I was reasonable. I was factual. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. Carl Jepson adjusted his glasses and looked down at a single sheet of paper in front of him. "The board has reviewed your, presentation," he began, his tone dismissive. "However, the covenant is clear. The aesthetic standard must be maintained. If you cannot clean it, the only remaining solution is to replace the entire driveway." I felt the blood drain from my face. Replace the driveway? That was a $20,000 project, over a stain. "The fines," he continued, "will continue to accrue at a rate of $100 per day until the violation is remediated to the board's satisfaction. This meeting is adjourned." It was a death sentence. A $1,000 fine was one thing. $100 a day was financial ruin. It was a waterfall of debt over something I didn't do and couldn't fix. I stood there, alone in the middle of that room, as the board members packed up their papers and left, chatting about their golf game as if they hadn't just shattered my financial security. The helplessness was a suffocating blanket. What could I possibly do? Fight a lawsuit against a well-funded HOA? Go bankrupt? Give up my home? I was trapped. I drove home, my hands shaking on the wheel, the weight of it all crushing me. But that night, as I stared at that damned stain in the moonlight from my living room window, a switch flipped. The despair began to curdle into something else, a cold, sharp, and focused determination. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. They had rules, but I had something they didn't expect. A desperate need for justice and nothing left to lose. I sat down at my computer, the glow of the screen the only light in the dark room. I wasn't going to search for cleaning solutions anymore. I typed 2 words into the search bar that would change everything. HOA lawyer. But what I found first wasn't a lawyer. It was a forgotten clause in the original bylaws, a piece of paperwork from the 1970s that every other homeowner and even the board itself had seemingly overlooked. A loophole, and it was glorious. The community clubhouse felt different this time. The air wasn't just cold, it was electric with anticipation. This wasn't a hearing, it was a trial, and for the first time, I wasn't the only defendant. Seated beside me was my secret weapon, a woman named Eleanor Vance, a retired real estate attorney with a steely gaze and a reputation for dismantling arrogant HOAs. She had taken my case pro bono, not for the money, but for the principle. She called it a civic cleaning. Across the room, Carl Jepsen and his board sat at their long table, their smug confidence barely contained. They thought I had come to beg, to work out a payment plan for the now astronomical fines. They were wrong. Carl gavelled the meeting to order, his voice dripping with condescending formality. Mr. Evans, we understand you've requested this special session. I hope you re-hear to finally comply with the board's decision and present a plan for driveway replacement. I took a slow breath. No, Mr. Jepsen. I'm here to discuss the board's failure to comply with its own governing documents. A ripple of murmuring went through the small audience of neighbors who had come to watch. Carl's smile tightened. I beg your pardon? Eleanor Vance didn't stand up. She simply spoke, her voice clear and cutting, every syllable a scalpel. Article 7, Section 2 of the Whispering Pines Original Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, filed with the county in 1973. It has never been amended. She let the words hang in the air. The board members shuffled their papers, confused. It states, Eleanor continued, that any and all alterations to a lot's exterior, including, and I quote, hardscaping, paving, or material changes to driveways and walkways, must be submitted to and approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Carl waved a dismissive hand. This is irrelevant. We are not discussing an alteration. We are discussing the removal of an eyesore. But you are, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Your final order was for me to replace the entire driveway. That is a massive alteration, a $20,000 project. And according to your own rules, you can't force me to do that without me first submitting plans to the ARC for approval. And you can't fine me for not doing an unapproved project. It's a catch-22 that you created. The color began to drain from Carl's face. He hadn't read the original bylaws in decades. He was operating on a simplified, modern rule book they handed out to new homeowners. The deep legal bedrock of the community was a mystery to him. Eleanor placed a single, pristine copy of the original covenant on the table. Furthermore, she said, her voice now filling the room, the bylaws specify the composition of the Architectural Review Committee. It is to be comprised of 5 members, 2 appointed by the board and 3 elected by the community. A simple records request shows that for the last 15 years, the ARC has consisted solely of board appointees. There has never been a community election. Therefore, every single architectural decision this HOA has made for over a decade, every approved fence, every painted shutter, every new mailbox, is technically invalid. You have been operating an illegal committee. The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. A board member to Carl's right slowly put his head in his hands. Carl Jepsen was floundering, a fish gasping on land. This is a technicality, a formality. We acted in good faith. And so did my client. Eleanor's voice snapped like a whip. He provided irrefutable evidence that the violation was pre-existing. He demonstrated a good faith effort to remediate it. Your response was to ignore evidence, bypass your own governance, and levy financially ruinous fines in what any court will see as a targeted harassment campaign. We are prepared to file suit against you and each board member personally for abuse of power, breach of covenant, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She let the threat hang in the air, a storm cloud ready to break. The personal liability part was a bluff, but they didn't know that. Their faces were sheets of white panic. I stood up then, looking not at the board but at my neighbors in the audience. This was never about a stain, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. It was about a man who wanted to show a new homeowner who was boss. You used a petty rule to try and break me, but you got lazy. You forgot the very rules you were supposed to uphold. You thought the power was yours to wield arbitrarily. You were wrong. I turned back to Carl Jepsen, who looked smaller now, shrunk into his chair. The aura of untouchable authority was gone, replaced by the shaky fear of a man who knows he's been caught. The fines, I said, the two words ringing with finality. Are they dismissed? All of them? Carl didn't speak. He just gave a single jerky nod, his eyes fixed on the table. And the violation notice? Eleanor added. Stricken from the record permanently? Another nod. The gavel was on the table in front of him. I reached over and picked it up. It felt heavier than I expected. I didn't hit it. I just held it, letting the board and everyone in that room understand the symbolic shift of power that had just occurred. I looked Carl Jepsen dead in the eye and delivered the final quiet blow. Meeting adjourned. The silence in the clubhouse was broken not by a gavel, but by a single, slow clap from the back of the room. Then another. And then the small audience of my neighbors, people I'd never really met, who had only known me as the guy with the messy driveway, erupted into applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. They had just witnessed a tyranny they'd likely grumbled about for years crumble in real time. In that moment, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I'd become a conduit for every simmering resentment in Whispering Pines. The following days were a whirlwind. The official letter from the HOA's lawyer arrived within 48 hours. It was a masterpiece of legal backpedaling. All fines were officially rescinded. The violation was permanently expunged from my property record. The letter also contained a formal apology for the procedural oversights that had led to the dispute. They called it an oversight. I called it a surrender. But the real change wasn't in the legal documents. It was in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. People I'd never spoken to would stop me on my evening walk. "Hey, you're the driveway guy," they'd say, often followed by a story of their own. The retired couple down the street showed me a folder of violation notices they'd received for a bird feeder that was 2 inches over regulation height. A young mother confessed her fear of putting up a pink flamingo lawn ornament for her daughter's birthday, worried it would trigger a fine. The stain on my driveway had become a symbol. It was no longer an eyesore. It was a battle standard. The pressure on Carl Jepsen and his board became unbearable. They had been exposed not just as bullies, but as incompetent ones. A petition began to circulate, calling for a special election to recall the entire board. It gathered signatures overnight. They didn't wait for the vote. 1 week after the meeting, Carl Jepsen resigned, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. The other board members followed suit within days. It was a total collapse. A new interim board was formed, and guess who was asked to join? Eleanor Vance, my brilliant attorney, agreed to serve as president pro tempore to help oversee a fair election. And me? They asked me too. I politely declined a board seat. ID had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime, but I agreed to consult on the rewrite of the CC&Rs. We spent weeks going through that dreaded binder line by line. We amended the archaic and punitive rules. We defined aesthetic violation with clear, objective standards. We reinstated a properly elected architectural review committee. We built in appeal processes that were fair and transparent. We didn't dismantle the HOA, we reformed it. We turned it from a weapon into a tool. As for the stain itself, it's still there. I never did replace the driveway. It's a part of my home's story now. Every time I pull in, that faint gray shadow is a reminder. A reminder of how quickly a dream can be threatened by petty power. A reminder that the most intimidating systems are often built on a foundation of sand, and all it takes is one person willing to dig to make them tremble. And most importantly, a reminder that you should never ever underestimate a quiet person who has been pushed too far. The impact of that single fight stretched far beyond my property line. The story, as these things do, spread to neighboring communities. I heard from friends of friends in other HOAs who had used our story as a precedent to challenge their own boards. We had created a playbook for justice. So, what's the takeaway from all this? It's that the rule book is only as powerful as the people who agree to follow it blindly. There's a difference between maintaining order and wielding power. I learned that you must read every line of every contract, no matter how boring, that you must document everything, that for every Carl Jepsen in the world, there might be an Eleanor Vance, waiting for a worthy cause. But the biggest lesson was about community. I moved to Whispering Pines for the house, but I found a community in the most unlikely way, by fighting the very institution that was supposed to represent it. True community isn't about uniform driveways and identical mailboxes. It's found in the shared nods of understanding between neighbors, in the collective sigh of relief when a burden is lifted, and in the courage to stand together against a common petty foe. My fight started over a stain I didn't create. But in the end, I realized I was cleaning up a much bigger mess that someone else had left behind. So, what's the one rule in your HOA or neighborhood that you're just done with? Let me know in the comments below.